time in those waves, something about the there's something philosophically relevant about it. The experience of responding to the waves appropriately, having that kind of power and force and current sort of take you over and bear you along. There's something about that which is distinctly other than narrative, or at least my narratives about what's occurring or why or whatever's occurring in my consciousness isn't, so much of it falls away. It seems less relevant, and there's sort of like a resetting, kind of being washed clean, and then there's an emergence of, okay, stepping back into the world again, but there's some sort of rejuvenation that's happened. And definitely something I feel, if I don't manage to cultivate a practice, a place, some rhythm of my life that affords that transformation, that stage of transformation, then I don't think I will have crafted a way of really the most optimal or healthy way of being for me.
Yeah, that resonates with me. That's for sure. And there's something about dislocation that seems, at least for me, that's very necessary to undertake that kind of disillusion. Because it's a very hard thing, I find, to attain when you're embedded, like when you're physically embedded in the place that habituates your course of life. It's a very, very difficult thing to alter the course of a narrative when it's actually cycling through the same forms that maintain it on a day-to-day basis. I find that very difficult. One of the things that's difficult about this time is precisely the constraint that prevents us from that dislocation, which I find is just essential. Some people, I think, are able to somehow some people are somehow able to replace themselves without physically replacing themselves. And I envy that. I find that's very difficult without actually doing it in an embodied way. And not having that available is very frustrating. It's not simply sort of it's not simply kind of a luxury to go on vacation. It's not really that I mean. It's the ability to to recast the perspective of life on the basis of how you take advantage on it. And that is a difficult thing to capture without actually being able to materially change the conditions that prop up the everyday. And I think that's one of the things that people are finding, people are articulating it in different ways and perhaps to various degrees of success. But I think that's one of the things that it's forcing a kind of, that the world has contracted for so many people, and it's contracted in such a way that the sense of possibility that usually attunes us to what is ultimate is removed. It dissipates, right? And I think that there's a kind of a loss of spirit. It's a dispiriting experience. And it's so incredible. I mean, this is something I've discovered over the last handful of months personally. I mean, I can see it when I look out at the world, but I don't need to, it's with me. The gravity of a loss of spirit, the loss of the capacity to aspirate possibility is so, it's so incredibly undermining, existentially undermining. And it's a very, very difficult thing to shrug off, Yeah. And the fatigue of it is a difficult thing to shrug off, because it's something that it just wears you down, right? It just wears you down. So I think that's that's where I am right now. Unfortunately, it's a tricky time, and it is for a lot of people when we're still kind of laboring under the foreclosure of the world, and also the change in the semiosis of the world too, because it doesn't signify as it did, right? The same aspects or appearances don't actually contain or entail there's not, the same depth that was once behind the appearance of the world is no longer behind the appearance of the world, because the affordances for action that are presented by those appearances are no longer there. So it's sort of like it's like when you're walking in the downtown of a city and there's some beautiful edifice that you see, and then you walk behind it and there's no building behind it. It's just an edifice, It starts to feel that way. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no, I hear that.
Yeah.
God, and I think what you just, that whole image you've painted there is something that can, I mean, it's a frame I think we can see into the structures of our culture with quite effectively. And I think COVID and our response to it and this loss of affordance is, the explicit thing that's being referenced here. But in some sense, this necessity of the environment and others and relationships supporting our transformative renewal of ourselves, these features of the ideal, well, what seems to me to be towards the way of an ideal human life, are perhaps those very features which are lacking in what is referenced as the meaning crisis, or which are, a key factor there. I consider things like addiction and the importance of those patterns and affordances around you after that come to God moment on one's knees. Am I able to step back into a life where there are opportunities, and is there support along the way to embed new rhythms of behavior and new patterns of behavior? Or am I stepping back into those self-same ones which were constricting me, or at least playing some similar narrative role that kept me trapped there? It's and how rigid I think it can seem as though our culture is to the kind of, and understandably so in some sense, the kind of broad scale change in community possibility, cultural possibility that I think many seek. How much that's not, precisely undesired, maybe by what one could speculate as the motives of the elite ruling class, which COVID having everyone sort of more or less trapped, more or less stuck in a similar non-renewing pattern of behavior inside these little boxes of apartments all in a row, in buildings that won't really last, in paying rent that can't really be afforded if one also wants to be able to, for example, go on vacation or take a holy day trip somewhere, and all the while our sort of attention is oriented, or there's clamors for our attention that orient us towards ever more narrowing, to borrow the sort of, a way of speaking that yourself and John call on so much, this reciprocal narrowing. That narrow us from these other possibilities. There's something so deep to trace there, and it's one of the, something in there moves me towards a kind of core lamentation that afflicts me when I seek to understand how I can be in some transformative relationship in a way of building differently in the world. It seems such a large, obviously such a large task, so many powerful forces.
Yeah, it is. And it's not something that can be it's something that requires a devout kind of patience, I'm discovering, because it's cumulative and it's incremental, and it requires a certain amount of feedback, a certain amount of affirmative feedback from the world in order to get traction, I think. And that's a difficult thing to come by too, right? You know, you don't like walk outside one day, inhale deeply and reacquire your spirit. It has much more to do, I think, with a gradual realization of potential implicit in each moment of being, if only it could be recognized by a power greater than, you know, one's immanent sense of self. And I think that's the problem, right? Our immanent senses of selves are not equipped for this. Not in isolation. Yeah. And absent some greater affinity, absent some, if I can put it this way, absent some correspondence to the transcendent, you know, contained within these frail bodies of ours, we're you know, we're hopelessly diminished. And I think that's part of, you know, part of the problem too here is that the edicts that we're living under, that we're still living under here, where I am, contain within them certain presuppositions, certain metaphysical presuppositions and existential presuppositions that deny spirit, because, you know, the protection of the body is something certainly to be desired. Bodily health is important, to be sure. You know, I'm not dismissing that, but the protection of the body at the cost of the spirit is really, it's a pretty inefficacious remedy for a time of plague. And, you know, I mean, it's easy to see how we're in that situation because, you know, edicts are handed down by states, and states by their nature are not equipped with the perspicacity to understand spirit because that's not their function. They're not organized that way. They don't have an order of complexity that can reverse engineer an understanding of spirit. That's just not their function. They can't do that. And to elevate them to a position that aspires to that is an idolatrous thing. And I think that's where we veer into ideological thinking when we call the state to remedy pathologies of spirit. And this is really this is a symbolic entity, this affliction that we're all facing. It's a biological one, I understand, but moreover, it has become a semiotic one. And it has infiltrated the spaces between bodies and the spaces between persons to the degree that we don't look out at the world and at each other with the same eye to action as we did before. Now, you know, that's reversible, I think, and thank goodness for that. But I think what's happened under our noses is a fundamental change in the way that we perceive the ontology of the world. It's like this isn't some kind of material inconvenience. This is a shift in our perspective of our own ontology as beings, and what kind of capacity we have to graduate that ontology. And the limitations of that are so existentially discomforting that they become nameless. You know, it's like after a while, we don't even know what the source of despair is, right? All we know is that it's there.
Yeah.
And a nameless despair is the most difficult one to confront.
You know, much of that is exemplified in the slogan that the Victorian state in Australia had to sort of sum up their COVID strategy and the social distancing. It was staying apart keeps us together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's mad.
Yeah. Slogans, yeah, they do. They drive me mad. And I mean, Yeah,
Yeah.
they really do. They really do.
Anyway,
Yeah. Anyway, I didn't mean to sideline into a rant
no,
about
no,
code. Yeah, I'm sorry, Tim. It's
not at
top
all.
of mind, and so there it was activated.
No, it's right there. It's right there, and it's not a side issue. It's oh, I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, these podcasts, you know, there's I'm going to try and set one up here. Although part of me thinks that sharing these last, you know, 5-10 minutes would be a nice thing too. But let me set this up, okay?
Go for it.
Because otherwise, I'm just likely to take the next branch. And if we had 8 hours and then could pay an editor a bunch of money, they might be able to cobble together some nice looking tree, but I'd still be out there surfing another branch. But okay, so there is a question that I think these past reflections can orient us toward exploring together. And it's a beautiful question. It's a simple question. It's one I mentioned to you in the email. And that question is, what is philosophy? And like, man, I I'm sort of greedily enjoying the imminence of just asking that question and having it sit there with the opportunity before us. It's probably much sweeter than how I'll manage to respond to it. But I'm very glad to ask that question with you and to see where that takes us. What is philosophy to you, Chris?
Yeah. It's a moving target, Tim. I mean, I thought I knew, 10 years ago and 5 years ago, and I think it's meant different things to me at different times. I mean, giving some kind of rote definition seems, just like a valueless thing to do. So maybe what I can tell you is what it means to me now at this precise moment, which is a much more authentic answer than to try and define it on its own terms. And what it is for me now, very powerfully, is simply the revelation of ignorance. And I don't know if it's because I'm slipping sideways into some kind of Greek skepticism or what. But so, okay, maybe two things. One is the revelation of ignorance, and on a good day, that means learned ignorance. The kind that Augustine talked about and Nicholas of Cusa talked about, where ignorance becomes a way to index attention back to the well, let's say, to redirect the eye of attention back to the negative presence of truth. And by the negative presence of truth, I mean everything that is by virtue of everything that is not here and now. And then related to that is I still recourse to the Delphic maxim, right? To know thyself, and the realization of ignorance, and the observance of that maxim are inseparable to me now, because I think I've reached a point where I've. I mean, this is a a personal disclosure rather than a philosophical one, but perhaps they're tied together. That so much of we are so numinously mysterious to ourselves, and most of us know that before we know that. We know it prospectively. We know it because we acquire vicarious knowledge that gives us testimony to that fact in advance of the experience. But I think that undergoing the experience of proper self-negation or self-disillusionment is such a comprehensively humbling experience that it seems to affirm some kind of lately, Tim, I'm gonna sidelong a little bit here because something is happening now that I had a feeling would happen, and I want to explain to you what it is. I find myself recently, it's costing me great effort to have these kinds of conversations right now, because I find that whatever language I can adduce to this seems only to diminish it. And that's not some kind of romantic valorization of silence or the ineffable or anything like that. I don't mean that for effect. I really don't. But philosophy to me right now is silence.
Mm-hmm.
And for whatever reason, at this particular point in time, at this juncture, whether because of the material circumstances that we've been lamenting about, or because of just happening upon a certain moment, I find it very, very, very difficult to exposit, to hold, let alone to exposit any positive belief about what philosophy is, whether to me or on its own merit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's because I'm renegotiating my relationship with it. And I'm renegotiating the imperative of that relationship and what it calls forth from me and what it seems to require of me. Because, the world is full of people who can speak like with incredible erudition about this, and there's really no need for me to do it, because they do it better anyway. And so for me, the meaning of philosophy, then I'm not trying to, this is not an act of subversion, Tim. I'm really happy to be talking to you. I trust that this is not an act of subversion. It's simply like a very honest reflection of the fact that somehow any explanation I could bring to bear in response to the question would be nothing as compared to the question itself. And there is something about the ignorance of the silence, the waiting ignorance, the expectant ignorance of the silence, that is an inexpressible, not a comfort necessarily, but it is the only thing that actually seems to be life affirming,
Mm-hmm.
when set against the din of 1,000 possible explanations. Socrates has this line in one of the dialogues. I think it's the Cratylus, where he says, we're talking about naming and the meaning of names. And he says, a name is an instrument that divides being. And I feel very beset by divided being. I seem to experience the world right now as a vivisection of endless divisions, endless alternatives, endless competing systems and competing frames of reference that account for what is true and what is meaningful. It's one of the reasons I tend to abstain from metaphysical positions, simply because I find that I can alternatively find beauty in many of them, and it seems to be an aesthetic sensibility that directs my philosophical appetites and attention rather than a logical one. There's a quote by a writer named Jack Lindsay, Australian, incidentally. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Jack Lindsay. He was sort of a 20th, wrote through the 20th century, and he was sort of a continentalist and took a great interest in Nietzsche and Nietzsche's abyssal experience with nihilism and nothingness. And when setting himself in Nietzsche's position, beholding the dark, he said, this is an abyss that cannot be crossed by any thread of logic, but by the wings of aesthetic intuition alone, the logic of which is the symmetry of those wings curving into flight. And when I read that, I feel an incredibly powerful affinity with it, because the silence of the spontaneously lived moment of proper attention eclipses any exposition that I could bring to bear on myself, and certainly that I could share with anyone else. And so at this moment, philosophy to me is the air that rushes through the wings of that aesthetic intuition as it bears its way and inclines itself to a greater vantage, to observe its own shadow on the face of the world, and with some hope and some possibility apprehends some fraction more of what it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's my non-answer to your question, Tim.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry for it.
Oh no, there's no. Well, it's interesting to speak of philosophy and then to confidently say something like, I wasn't seeking the answer, I was certainly seeking your response. And I think that is it's part of the key to living this question. What is philosophy? This dynamic of seeking and silence and response. Chuck a question in there somewhere. Yeah. I, in some sense, I would say simplicity, but just the shortness of this question, you can go into a title, what is philosophy? 3 words. There's something about the simplicity of it in that sense, which somehow ties it into an importance or a closeness to me, because it's like an authentic door opener or invitation. I am seeking, whether with this conversation, whether posted or not, but I am always oscillating between the degree to which I want to share moments like these, conversations like these, that that's seeking spirit, that is those wings which are, against all odds, somehow seeking to find symmetry and balance themselves on the current so that they don't crash back down to earth, and that maybe they can play some role of balancing so as to enable vision that might somehow be helpful. There's something so humbling about it, and that and the fear of falling. Not so much that, it's like the moment of, it's like recognizing the unspeakability in the sense that you were referencing, and recognizing that the translation of that silence into words on the cusp, and that I have to do it in sentences that mean something to you. It's so hard for me to finish sentences sometimes, because I realize maybe I've jumped off on slightly the wrong way, and my first priority in some sense is to maintain the integrity of that compass toward an orientation that maybe is just my kind of silent flailing process of balancing myself over a personal abyss, and I haven't yet even managed to join up with anyone else. It's somehow like, to invite anyone into anything, to try and navigate a way through a set of ideas, even for some expected outcome or some endeavor to convince or say, this is how it is, whether it's a podcast or an essay, it's something I want to communicate. This is a message I have to share. I kind of like to imprint that or somehow influence that. I so rarely, if ever, feel a sense of, from beginning to end, and then in the silence between to the publishing, feel like the integrity remains such as to uphold my desire to share that, because there's something about this fundamental, more primary creation together here, is call and response, out there, and the rebalancing, the immanence of that here, the practice of that there, the sacredness is there. I can hold myself to that, and it's hard to hold myself to words of yesterday, and maybe the most artful I can be, and I certainly try to hold myself to the meaning that I tried to communicate in words of yesterday. Here are some values. Here's what I commit to do with someone else. Here's my hopes for the world. But there's a trap in there, somewhere. The fixation of ourselves to conceptions past, and as contrasted with an authentic, well, such a beautiful metaphor, this flying, this wings of intuition. In my lexicon, some sort of walk through a dimly lit garden that maybe we can illuminate together and come to know in some sense, and then we go home, and we have to do the whole thing again, and maybe we find the same things. We probably do. There's a certain groove to the path, but the garden's very much still to be met again. So the only other thing to say, of course it isn't the only thing to say, is that it's funny. You said you don't feel like you're have anything to add to this question in some sense, or that others might be more erudite, ready to respond. But to be perfectly honest with you, I wouldn't have, if you had said, look, mate, I'm not going to be able to have this chat for another 5-10 years, I wouldn't have asked anyone else. I wanted to talk to you about this. So take that for what it is. It's a strange thing to say in some sense, because it's not so much the question, it's what I know. It's what I know to be found in response to that question, which is sacred to me. And we've only spoken to each other one time before, but of course I've heard you speak lots, and for so many reasons it makes sense that we haven't spoken more than that. I almost like there's so much to be said, but I also didn't somehow need to say it. It's like a strange trust that that there was a resonance for the aesthetic space, duration, unlocked by a question like that, which there's just no sense in rushing it. There's no sense in even preparing for it in any technical sense, other than to seek to live as well as I can up to it, and in that sense prepare for it. So I think I have I'm coming in some sense to quite a radical answer to this question of what is philosophy. And it's something like, I don't, maybe rather than respond exactly like that, it's like when I look around and there are a bunch of philosophers and they have positions and they talk about this and that. Not most of the ones I seek out. I'm more of the technical academic kind. Certainly the ones that identify with positions here and there and have technical reasons for doing so, and are part of, I guess, communication societies with lexicons that can end up somewhat isolated from the reckoning of this language with the kind of cries of being in the world as we're living with it currently. Some separation there. I just don't know if I don't know if I find philosophy in, I don't know if I find, it's weird. It's like I find philosophy in words, but I'm not sure that's the fundamental process occurring that enables that. It's like, and to alight on and in that process together, whatever that is, and we can name it, some words like dialogos, this dialogical transformation, this participation in a kind of rhythmic call and response, that calls on senses of aesthetic and kind of vital self-making biology grooved into us over thousands of years, as well as somehow a relationship with potential, like what that is, and how showing up to that with each other in relation to ignorance, then in relation to the not knowing of what awaits us in the response, something like that. There's something about that process and the vulnerability of that. And I know I'm not saying anything here which is leading us in locations in the garden that maybe you haven't been before, and that underlie so much, I think, of your reflections with John Bavecki and in many other conversations. And in some sense, I'm echoing those out from my own coordinates on this exploration together. But I don't see philosophy as something dry, hidden away, uh, like uh, disembodied and uh, like necessarily elitist. And at the same time, there's a real gift to the education required, and the education to be able to be familiar with the language that philosophers use is a gift, and I appreciate that. And the thing is, it's just right, no matter the language, like what that process, that drive in us, that nature in us, which seeks out philosophy, which does philosophy. I almost can't distinguish it in some sense from the something necessary for life, and I'm okay with blurring it in that way. And then when I sit down and write on a page, I'll say a whole bunch of different things and try and be somehow more clear. But I it's I guess what I'm saying so many things, and apologize for that in some sense, but there's I I I I don't I do not seek an expert to tell me what philosophy is.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Tim. All of it. We we seem to have come to this bridge equidistantly, and we're both looking down at the rushing river and wondering, like, okay, well, it's it's that.
Mm.
It's that. And we we who talk about these things and think about these things, I think, alternate between two modes. One is two modes that are both very archetypal. One is, if I can use this term, is the erotic, which is a kind of the wordless longing for the eternal aspect of ourselves, which is something I'm thinking about a lot these days. And
Man, that
then
was tight. That was beautiful.
and then the logos, um the the gathering of intelligibility, and the um and the systematization of some approximate object of that longing. And that object is never satisfying, nor should it be. And that object never seems to beg commitment, at least for me. I find the longing infinitely more real than the object that it happens um, um, to conjure as a surrogate for its true object. And I think that because of that, any position we take, and I don't mean to be technically skeptical when I say this. I don't think it's a particularly controversial thing to say, but that any position that we take, metaphysically speaking, is provisional and and um, and approximate at best. And I find it very difficult to do what so many of my friends and fellows do, people who are much smarter than me and who have devoted many, 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 many years of thinking and rigorous contemplation to these questions, who are able to manifest authentic convictions and commitments to those hyper objects of belief. those hyper objects of belief that correspond to those metaphysical positions. And one thing I've learned about myself is that I don't have it in me to do that with any great continuity. I can do it in moments, I have momentary convictions, usually called in response to some dialectical setting that seems to produce them spontaneously, and that they seem to be pragmatically suited to. Mm-hmm. I feel as though philosophical convictions for me are a matter of instrumental, they're instrumentally pragmatic. That's a redundant thing to say anyway. Which is to say that they have provisional uses, and those uses are true. Those uses are real and valuable. But it's I think I somehow feel about philosophical convictions the way Wittgenstein thought about language, or something like that. It's like it they protrude from whatever unconscious reservoir holds their sum of potential. And that sum of potential does seem to correspond to whatever ground we associate with the experience of eternity. That undifferentiated sense of eternity before the divisions of being start to class the world of experience. But somehow I find myself increasingly disinterested in the classes of belief that emerge from the world of experience. That's not a very useful attitude, because it's maladaptive to situations like, well, not like this, because you're here with me, and I think we're speaking the same language. But it's maladaptive to those situations where you're called to participate in, in dialogues that whose object is the disquisition of philosophical concepts, and I feel that tension constantly, like that tension between the eros of undifferentiated longing and the logos of having to arrange the objects of that longing into some kind of discernible order through which to live and speak and be understood. And that alternation is something I actually find increasingly taxing, strangely enough. But I don't want to abandon it either. Because abandoning the conceptual rigor of logos is not in itself in service of the erotic either.
Yep.
Right? They have a dialectical relationship, and justly so. And, I don't want to succumb to an impulse to abscond from one in a fit of misplaced loyalty to the other. Mm-hmm. Even though I often find that impulse really rapacious. And that's such a curious thing to me. It's such a curious thing to me. And I think it does have something to do with being aesthetically oriented rather than analytically oriented, or something like that, that just as a rough distinction. But one of the things I've had this forms of this conversation, talking about this concern with a couple of people, a couple of very close friends, one of whom, of course, is John. and they remind me that um, that well, simply that one person doesn't have to be all things to all people, and that whatever mode of recognition is native to the philosophical interest is the right mode to follow.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, yeah.
No, I hear you. I think so. So this leads me a little bit towards something something in something about the kind of practical scaffolding of the forum, the stage, the field of philosophy to come, that that at least some part of myself seems pretty damn well committed to helping to realize, helping to build. And it's and this scaffolding is seeking the creation of the conditions of possibility for philosophy, for the the height and the depth of dialogical relationship that can invite and welcome the participation of these sides of the orientation, the intellectual, the analytic, and the intuitional. Sometimes I use the word mystical in place of the intuitional. And you know, the perhaps our world always, I don't know, certainly our world now seems to be more in danger than ever of the powerful oscillations um, that afflict us in, for instance, the domains politics, attitude toward so many things, because of how much power we have. You know, the tails of the distribution, the extremes, with certainty of righteousness, have ever more power to inflict harm to achieve what they desire, and they can do so in the name of protecting the truth and the way it ought to be. And across so many of these dimensions, these continuums of oscillation, cognitive styles, personality types, cultural dispositions, we face these problems. And so how to approach that in the context where famously, or at least the meme is out there, that our attention spans are diminishing. And I certainly find myself often in patterns of kind of micro addictions, which diminish my capacity to pay attention to certain tasks. And then, you know, I'm here, of course, and I'm utterly here with my whole being for however many hours necessary, fundamentally. So, and I think maybe a lot of people are this way. It's like maybe our attention is just fine, but our context is fucked. Our context is getting us, and you know, and that context can be ourselves in some sense, and what we've built into ourselves, or had inflicted into ourselves, grooved into ourselves. But what is the kind of the cultural, and this question has so many eddies, and there's so much to say. I have so much to say, and so much I'd like to communicate about it. And interestingly, I seek to do so ultimately with a, uh, a capacity for logos that is, you know, as supreme as possible. Like the foundations of the context for philosophy, it must very much take this into account in as much as possible. But I think of how much, for instance, how much time is needed, how much we have to develop the capacity to listen despite an immediate, maybe unable, might not be able to follow exactly what's being said. There's a fine balance there, because sometimes you do need to jump in. So I'm going to go all over the place here, but I think it's worthwhile. So there's this phenomenon also of kind of like edutainment, you know, and in some sense, if I was to speak to the virtue of this, which I actually don't often do, but right now I think maybe I will. Maybe the virtue in this is something that, well, this is a way to engage people in some interesting and important educational content, okay, and we're trying to adapt this to a new moment. And it can go, of course, horribly. We can, very dangerous thing. We can start to, addict ourselves to whole different ways of business patterns and whatever. But there's something of the aesthetic to be brought in such a grand scheme. Like, I think, like, over weeks, right, with hundreds of people, in all manner of different forums and rhythms and modes, which then somehow create a kind of artifacts or not, or questions that can then be brought into a next moment, like how to truly welcome in and to maximally include the plurality of perspectives, stances on this being that we are unfolding together, and the what is necessary to remember of its vitality, what we should really care about in relationship to what we can also say about the world and its effects on all these different levels of vitality we have to care about, both of our lineage and also of a kind of projected potential future. There's so much there, and through it all, the care for the immanence of wherever we are now remains most fundamental. And yet there is this broad, there is this, like, a casting into the future, and a kind of a commitment to the importance of that, which is and has to be grounded on a rigor of enough of the picture of just what is going on, that requires the ongoing care for this process of enacting wisdom process together. I was looking for some way to phrase, like, being in relationship with ignorance or something like this, but I couldn't quite get the words. But it has to be built, and I think about just how difficult it is in my life to even reckon with how to take forward this podcast, like what it is to summon the right relationship of being here together. Not something I was at all concerned about with you, hence everything I've said. And but it's when we think about how to relate to the kind of experts and people who otherwise command, let's just say, people who command a lot of attention. Jordan Peterson is a prime example of someone who has a lot of followers on YouTube, for instance. If his name's in a video and he's there, it's going to bring in several 100,000 people. And those people, 99%, who knows what number, most of them want to hear from Jordan. And there is, and I've experienced this dynamic with other people, if one steps outside of the perceived kind of Overton window of what an interviewer or someone who has a channel, an interlocutor, is able to put forward, there's going to be quite a lot of pushback. We don't want to hear from you. We want to hear from this person. We want to hear how this. Maybe we want to hear how this position relates to this particular position. The vulnerability and the realness of relationship to be realized and presenced, and all of the vulnerability to the ontologies that can be brought forward through that, and which in some sense that must be protected somehow. Plenty to say on that in terms of even the mechanisms of distribution, all part of this context, this open source one maybe not being appropriate for the kind of vulnerability of ontology to be present in some instances, although I still desire a certain, like the access to it, rather than, I'm not talking about something closed either, this more of a middle. But point is, the summoning, the allowance for the space for a genuine dialogue when that relationship hasn't otherwise been established, is so challenging. And it's one of those things that I would say the majority of people don't even know that they're actually seeking. And I don't know how much capacity we have to even allow in others who, of course, in my case, aren't going to have the capacity of erudition to speak so inclusively and remain relevant to the number of people required to somehow keep that energy where it needs to be. I can try, and that's part of the artfulness of developing. And I think that's the skill to develop. But to do that without stepping into a kind of, sophistry again, all salience without relevance, and to still be on the line of where my soul needs to meet you here, and have that again, and have somewhere of that be a balancing dynamic. Maybe is it not balancing, a guiding light for how to navigate ultimately potentially the most profound disagreements of the logos mind, that might entirely unscaffold like whole aspects of identity attached views, ultimately not leaving one bereft of that more fundamental capacity to be here and appreciate. But maybe that's not the thing that's even, maybe that's the thing that's not even, it's not knowingly valued. Anyway, I said a lot there, but all of these things are, to me, they're obviously running around in my mind as ongoing problems to wrestle with.
Yeah. Oh, Tim, you said all kinds of really provocative things. God, where to begin or to continue? I mean,
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, one of the things I think that well, this includes me too, for that matter, that we tend to misapprehend so easily, especially in the online discourse space, which is something I was initially so endeared to and impressed by, and now have a very ambivalent relationship to. There's so much about it to be commended. There's so much virtue to it, but there are many corresponding vices to it as well, and cults of personality being but one. And I think one of the problems is that we tend to, when we look upon people who have earned a profile of a great pedagogical profile. Peterson obviously is like the apex example right now, but John's another such person, and there are dozens now, right, operating in the space. Is that we tend to mistake their thinking as having a static nature, and I mean it doesn't, right? This occurred to me when you talked about the vulnerability, and one of the things that you have to really pay attention closely to actually pick up on this, unless you happen to know one of these people personally. But what becomes very obvious is that this is a game of constant adaptation. There's a developmental track to this that is much more volatile than people think, and even the most learned and erudite of people, when they're functioning in this space, they are constantly dissolving and resolving they're not only their structures of pedagogy, but they're fundamental structures of belief and philosophical orientation. Like these are not static entities fixed in time. These are dynamical things that are changing over the course of time, right? And I had one of these moments recently when it's the most obvious of realizations, but the most obvious of realizations are also the ones that are most deeply felt and resonant, which is that, you can stand still and change in spite of yourself. You can abstain and keep yourself on reserve and be as conservative as you possibly can by minimizing your interactions and your susceptibility to change, and yet you will, if only by omission. If only by omission. We do not stay in one place, right? Thank you, Heraclitus. And, that seems so obvious when we talk about it as a principle or as a theorem or something. But as applied to embodied human beings that are broadcasting themselves constantly, it tends to be forgotten very, very quickly. And that's and you'll see, right? If you track the thinking of any one of these people, and sometimes it's to their great credit, right? Especially if they do so reflectively and self-consciously, understanding that it will happen to them regardless, and so they may as well try and remain as attentive to it as possible. But you'll see that the tenor of ideas will change, the form of those ideas will change, the order of their priority and the order of their conviction will change, and to me, that's I actually find a great measure of relief from that. I find a great measure of relief in the impermanence of opinion and the impermanence of conviction, because it doesn't, time doesn't suffer conviction very well, or opinion. Age and change and suffering are far more resolute than are the most ardent of opinions. And at some point there is a category change between the conviction that we associate with opinions and that which we might associate with something like faith. I don't hold them to be the same. They are distinct. But it is very difficult sometimes, without knowing someone intimately, to divine one from the other. And one of the things that we forget very easily, and I forget it too, is that the utterances that we make in responses to contexts that foist their conditions on us and activate certain parts of our nature. And trait, personality plays into that, character plays into that, all kinds of things contribute to the complexion of a philosophical belief or disposition. And that means that what you've described as the call and response function of intimate social philosophical interfacing, such as we're doing right now, changes the humor of our philosophical identities. And how could it not? How could it not? Right? How could it not? And that, to me, ends up feeling much more real. Much more real. And it makes me leery, conversely, of proffering an opinion or a thought or a position on something when I know of myself, and perhaps this is this may be simply a weakness of character and education on my part. I'm willing to admit that's a possibility. But I know of myself that provided a different set of pragmatic constraints, I will morph and be chameleonic and change my colors to match the conditions that afford me the most real connection with those people who are likely to bring forth what is already most real in me. Right? And that means that the meaning of what is offered changes, because suddenly there is suddenly it's a matter of pragmatic conveyance, not a matter of propositional certitude. And yet, propositional certitudes, used ironically in the way that Socrates used them, can be remarkably efficient instruments for effecting the modal changes of engagement that actually allow us to attune to what's more real. And that's why, going back to the silence after the noise is so necessary, because the noise was only useful insofar as it substituted for the totality of that silence and referred us back to it. And that is the irony. That is the irony of speech, is that it strives for its extinction, as it should, in some sense, right? Because it's the divided being attempting to reacquire its unity. And the longing for that unity, to me, attitudinally, often gives rise to this impulse to abstain altogether from the entire enterprise. And I'm constantly fighting, trying to beat back that impulse. But I'm grateful for the impulse, because the impulse helps to countervail against the risk of becoming so lost in the discourse that the discourse becomes it becomes it becomes the index of its own success as a project, if that makes any sense. Anyway, I hope that was properly in response to what you said, because all of that to me came out of what you said, but I hope you feel that way too. And
Yes. Speech is dying well. If I die well into a sentence, it's so interesting, because it's also speaking until complete is all of a sudden the same thing as that, hey?
Yeah, that's right. Dying into a sentence. I like that a lot.
And when oh man, you interrupted me. I'm not finished dying yet. And it's upsetting not to have died then and there. It's like we have to it's like letting, but it's just the practice of letting go, but the gracefulness of letting go, because there's something, if we don't let go gracefully, there's part of us that's for whatever reason somehow still holding on, unwilling to release, kind of traumatized. I mean, that's a bit much maybe, but in some circumstances we could imagine some theatrical context, where it very much would be the case. People speak, I never got to say these words to a loved one or something like this. They never found that, elicited that expression that was part and parcel of turning the page, turning the corner. And maybe that can happen internally. And in some sense, I do believe that this dialogical process we speak to between you and I, between people, It has seemed to me that this pattern of we can say call and response. I have more poetic words to say in writing, but this dialogical relationship, it's the reality of the council within as well. Forrest Landry likes to say, like, in a council, and
council within.
yeah, and so it's somehow this right relationship of council within meeting a council without, set in somewhere beautiful, but where there's certainly that line of awe and terror with the grandiosity perhaps of nature and the storm clouds over the horizon as the sun sets beautifully, or something like this, that I'd also like to see as part of that picture. And so, I mean, mystically, this following this inner relationship, this relation seeking itself, where we pass through this, where we die into a sort of silence, and from that a re-emergence, or this, solve et coagula, so many ways to speak about this right dynamical relationship.
Yeah.
How it's like the dream, one of the, you can say, some sort of fantasy of articulated faith that's guiding me, and seems to be inherent to discussion around terms like collective intelligence, which somehow for me doesn't quite capture the poesis of what I think I'm seeking to speak to here. But this whatever this wave, this transformation, occurring, is this flow. If there's a right, like an alignment within me as I die into, maybe it's into a provocation, maybe it's an invitation. I mean, I'm thinking of propositions in some sense as provocations in many instances. We're putting on the hat of this kind of belief, and here, what are we going to do about this then? As I pass it over, and for that to be taken up then, and I mean, as we're seeking to hear, but I do think what that looks like, and it's why I think, games like the glass bead game, which you might have seen,
yes,
Lawrence Curry Clark playing that, we've played it a number of times, and there's definitely utility to it, particularly for our purposes here, with the experimentation with timed turns, because there's a sense in which one of the barriers to entry I've found, at least into dialogues like this, is, I'm speaking for several minutes at a time, and I enjoy listening to someone speak for several minutes at a time, or short. I like that. And I seem to have a capacity to take that in and be with that picture. And I consider that a dialogue. I could probably consider a dialogue over 10 hours with 5 exchanges of 1 hour a dialogue, but for many that would be a kind of monological. And but again, what is present in the presentation, in the performance of speech, if that is performed as a kind of dialogue, then we can open up, I think, both the expanse of long duration with much speaking in each part, as well as we can, like, imagine these fantasies of, and I attempt this and have attempted this on many occasions now in different group settings, with fellow explorers in voicecraft.network, of these, when you of attempting this philia sophia, this dialogue together, where there are shorter turns, that can we pass it across the plurality of expressions who feel in their time, now is my moment to die next. There's something like, and what is the the art form of that, you know, I consider stepping into a dance at a festival where you might have, generally for me, I've found them to be in smaller stages where you might have 100, 150 people, and there's just such a clear synchronization of this, like it's like a synchronization of sameness, of certainly resonance, and at the same time it's novel for everyone to engage with at the same time, and you can kind of drop into it, and where there's something in there that's a fantasy of an art form that is, you know, it's something I find motivating and inspirational from time to time, and then part of me wonders as well if all of this is not just part of my childhood, in some sense, wounding of giving up on, not giving up on, but sort of through for various reasons, changes in my life conspiring to, you know, remove the music, the playing music from my life. I stopped piano, and I stopped singing when I was quite young, but it was how I connected to the sacred when I was young. And someone asked me the question, you know, well, if you start again, what kind of skill or what would you do or be? It would probably be a musician. And it's something like this. Part of me does, you know, the lamentation is chasing the tail of music with a too limited instrumentation or something like this. But I don't think that's the full of it. I actually do think there is something, again, to this logos built in there that can, you know, it constellates a different possibility of art form. Maybe that's where it comes in some sense. I don't know. But you've still got the symmetry in music, so I don't know about that. Anyway.
Yeah. When you were talking about the sort of the dance, this image of this large group and stepping into formation, into something fluid, like a dance. So let me ask you, I mean, that last bit you just mentioned about, you know, chasing the disappearing tail of music. Is that something that is, what is it that I'm trying to ask you here? What for you ends up being the function of that tail? Is it something that, is it something whose disappearance, and I mean disappearance not as something past, but I mean disappearance as a present action, the action of currently disappearing? Because that's sort of the image I got. You talked about your relationship to music. I got this impression of something retreating away from you, but that you still had a line of sight on. And that, to me, presents two very, very different valences, one of which is aspired, and the other of which is fatality. And often, at least in my experience, the two come paired quite frequently. And there's something about the implicit tragedy of being a person that is also paradoxically the source of all vitality, right? Our tragedy is the source of our vitality, I think. Or at least the conditions that give rise to that particular The conditions that give rise to the form of tragedy as we know it are precisely those conditions that are that seed life, its vitality. And when I hear you speak about music, I get a simultaneous impression of both the despair of that tragedy and also the faith that inheres it. I get both at the same time. The loss of possibility, again, loss as a present event, not as a past one, is something that grants the urgency of being that I think is part of what awakens us, right? Remembers us, causes us to recollect that we are beings of possibility at times when such things are easy to forget, and that the tragedy of finiteness and finitude carries with it an imperative to attend to the source of that tragedy. And so when you talk about music, that's what comes to me. And I'm wondering how that lands for you.
Oh, it lands beautifully. Yeah, thank you for saying that. It's that was really very very profound to listen to. I don't know if I can wend the most important words you used together well enough to follow. But one thing that was coming to me, perhaps to express a little bit as well of where I'm coming from, perhaps in relationship to the music, is there's something of a prior to justification, propositional justification, that is available in that moment in that duration of music, of living the music. That is, I mean, it can both be something that is the source of, or the source to be presenced as a remembering, and at the same time that we also, that I think is aspired to, maybe is aspired to in our systems of justification, as laying the platforms and foundations to now step onto that enable a bringing of this lineage of alignment of our nature and our proclivity and our connection to the world and ourselves, to culture, through how can we and the lamentation, the giving up in some sense of, I suppose there's something like pursuing a life grounded on music. I mean, it is, my life still is grounded in music, but it's something in there of planting a tree that you don't get to sit in the shade of, that famous expression. Mm-hmm. And I spoke earlier, right at the start, perhaps before this, of what we include in the recording, of sickness a little bit, and the importance of, you made the remark, the importance of bodily health in relationship as well to spiritual health. But I've been sick recently. I was sick for a little while with some sort of flu, not COVID, I believe. But obviously my capacity was extremely diminished and and I wasn't doing too much philosophy then, and I'm struggling now to recollect the link between that sickness and this sitting in the shade of the trees. But it's almost there. Anyway, the image is like, it's that being in service to God. This is such a crazy sentence to say. Being in service to music, like as such, the possibility for it, as distinct from the enjoyment of being that one who is performing and living that music. And of course, we all have our time, but I hope at least that I'm not so deluded as to be deluded about the knowing I have for myself that has led me to along this path of seeking like an understanding of the integration of this musical nature with the scientific propositional, with the analytical, with the clarity of symmetry required for the most stable foundations we can presently pragmatically commit ourselves to. Right. And there's just something about that, the loss of, like, when the music kind of ends, or even in that tragic sonorous note that one lives, as much as that is somehow trans narrative in its immanent just giving and being there, at the same time there feels to be something in me, whether we could give some psychological story of how it comes to be, but I've sensed it in so many others too, of course, that the conditions enabling us to be here and enjoy the music aren't actually going to take care of themselves, and
Oh, yeah.
while the universe and nature provides for us in a sense, it only part of the way. And so it's, I suppose one could look at it as some sort of developmental thing, but it's that tragedy of the finitude again, and how to be in right relationship with the continuity of that beauty is ultimately to accept the death of that beauty in the moment, but maintain a faith and a rigorous relationship with that faith, to enable the possibility of being with that music again. Something like that.
Oh, beautifully said, Tim. Really beautifully said. Yeah. It's something, if I understood you right, it's music is something into which you die. And is a symbol. I mean that in the most sacred sense of the term, by which and through which to live and die. And you're right, it doesn't just take care of itself. And depending on how we frame the task of helping to take care of it so that it can take care of us, that either means to remove everything that can obfuscate our view from it, or to add only that which supports our attention and sustains our attention, to train on it. And I guess we can frame it in either way. It just depends on whether we want to speak of it positively or negatively. But in either case, we have to somehow find a way to organize our attention such that it concentrates on that which returns us to a sacred death. It's something I find very difficult as well.
Yeah.
You know, finding that yeah, to put it mildly, finding that by which to live and die is precisely what we've lost, right? Not all as individuals, but certainly collectively we've lost. And because I think one of the things that one of the realizations that's sort of stolen upon me in the last few years is that, you know, my life's not my own, and that it grounds out well beyond the point where my ignorance begins. And that realization is in turns is sometimes brings a great deal of absolution and sometimes brings an incredible amount of despair, and sometimes both, because of course you can't have one without the other. But this idea of finding God, I love the way you put this, so I keep wanting to say it this way now. Finding that into which you may die is, it seems as good a way of framing the task as any I've heard. And I mean that, I suppose, at every level of meaning, at every level of resolution. Disambiguate that any number of ways, but I think it's true in all of them. And yeah.
It's and which is paradoxically, maybe not the wrong, never probably use that word correctly, but that right death as being for life, you know, and that's the resonance with which I feel that expression as you speak it, and it's, you know, perhaps an important qualifier. I was once speaking to a man who is a friend and a mentor to me, and perhaps he, because of some tragedy he's experienced with the passing of the suicide of his son some years ago, he is quite sensitive to formulations of this is something to sort of to die for, you know. It's like something to live for, Tim, you know, matters how you say it. And it I think, as I reflect here, it matters how you say it rather than necessarily the explicit words you say. And the reality is, I think both living for something and dying for something, they imply each other. And so I suppose I just mentioned that as an ode to what has been quite a profound moment for me there as I reflect. But I wonder about closing up here, just for the sake of energy. Really, I truly would delight in taking this conversation on, but I truly am conscious of the energy that goes into these interactions. I hope and I intend always for these to be in some sense enabling of rejuvenation at some profound level, but physically, energetically, I do find they take quite a lot, and so I want to respect that, and perhaps leave us 5 or 10 minutes to integrate a little bit with the recording button off.
That
But
sounds
I'd
good.
love to invite you to share anything you have, if you feel there's something you'd like to share in closing to find some sort of completeness here, or if not, that's all good too.
No, thank you, Tim. I feel I'm very grateful to you. You inspire a lot of confidence. I mean, I found this when I talked to you last time, and it's true again. And you inspire a certain intimate kind of disclosure, and so consequently, you know, I apologize. The sort of the version of me that you got today was a very disjointed and scattered one. But I also felt like that's what's true right now, and I felt like you invited whatever was true. You invited it because it was authentic, and I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that, and yeah, I'd talk to you anytime, my friend.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, no, appreciate I appreciate you sharing in such a mode. It's truly, I have many perspectives on the utility and the dynamics of, profoundly philosophical interaction in the public sphere, and what it means, what it costs. There's a cost. For me, there's been a cost to it, a tremendous opportunity for growth, but also a cost. And it's
Yeah,
like so many things that touch on terms like faith and spirit and sacredness, like these profound things, like the this is for another conversation, but the relationship between the cost I'm speaking about here and the function of monetization in our current economy, in relationship to that cost, in relationship to sacredness, that is one tremendously tortured relationship. And well, for another time. But yeah, thank you so much, man. Honestly, it's such a privilege, and I'd just like to thank you for your work with John, and all of the energy you've shared digitally. I know that for me, and and for a number of others, if you've mentioned to me this giving of confidence. I like when I hear yourself, John and Guy. I've heard so much of you. Um, so often I'm just like, oh, these fucking legends. Like I can't just coming back to it. It's like it's like it's because of the integrity and commitment to the feeling of the dialogue, quite aside from anything else. There is just the return and the effort. Like there's these leaps taken. It's like, and there's so many landings made. And yeah, i I appreciate it. It's been nice to find some fellows out there, uh that I that I that I've take inspiration from on a journey which felt certainly lonely at the beginning, and there was less language to share about it. So there we go.
thank you, Tim. Thank you.